Venezuela was supposed to break. For decades, the world watched a slow motion car crash in Venezuela. We spoke of fall of the regime as a hypothetical possibility. Then, in the early hours of January 3rd, 2026, the hypothetical became history. But Venezuela didn't break, not the way anyone predicted. Today, something strange has emerged. Not victory, not defeat. Something in between. A standoff that neither side controls anymore. Now, the real question is, what happens when pressure stops working? The question is, what paths are now realistically open, and which of them can Washington influence? Three futures now stand in front of Venezuela, and none of them are as simple as the headline suggests. At first glance, Venezuela may seem like a side story in a world focused on Ukraine, China, AI, and climate change. But geography and resources still matter. Venezuela holds more proven oil reserves than Saudi Arabia and has triggered a migration crisis impacting 7 million people across Colombia, Brazil, and up to the US border. When Washington moved to decapitate the leadership in Caracas, it wasn't just about democracy, it was about the reassertion of American dominance in its own backyard. However, dominance doesn't guarantee stability. The US now faces issues like debt, failing infrastructure, and a disorganized but still armed military. Let's be clear about what happened. US sanctions did enormous damage. Venezuela's economy shrank by 75%. Hyperinflation eroded personal savings, and millions of citizens left the country. By traditional thinking, the pressure campaign achieved its objectives. Except for one problem, the government survived anyway. They found workarounds, shadow banking networks, oil exports to China and India through intermediaries, cryptocurrency, trade routes Washington couldn't easily block. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The United States still has power over Venezuela, but no longer full control over outcomes. That's why the future now has three distinct branches. The first future is the one Washington is currently trying to build: managed reconstruction. Imagine a scenario with limited sanctions relief. Oil output rises slowly, allowing Venezuela to generate sufficient income to steady the economy, not thrive, but survive. In this scenario, the US effectively becomes the administrator of Venezuela. The political system remains largely unbroken. Elections happen, but within tight constraints. Opposition exists, but power does not truly change hands. It's democracy in name, authoritarianism in practice. From Washington's perspective, this isn't what they wanted, but it checks certain boxes. Migration slows, regional stability improves, and energy markets ease. This future doesn't feel like a victory, it feels manageable. But this path is a minefield. How can elections proceed when the former ruling party controls gangs? How does the US exit without the entire structure collapsing? On the other hand, quietly, China tolerates this outcome, not because it prefers US engagement, but because stability protects its investments. The second possibility is darker, though less dramatic: permanent limbo. Venezuela doesn't stabilize, but it doesn't collapse either. It exists in a permanent state of limbo. Sanctions remain but become inconsistent, enforced when politically convenient. China and Russia provide limited support, enough to prevent total failure, yet inadequate for full recovery. The economy contracts, people endure rather than prosper. The government focuses on handling shortages rather than fostering economic growth. This is the gray zone state, permanently stuck between international acceptance and total isolation. Here's why this matters. It creates a dangerous precedent. It shows the world that defying US pressure doesn't necessarily lead to regime change. It further indicates that prolonged isolation can be sustained when a country is prepared to accept reduced living standards. Cuba survived decades this way. Now Venezuela might prove it's still possible in the 21st century. The third scenario is the one that keeps strategists awake at night. The Great Spillover. Not because of what the US does, but because of what happens when internal pressures finally break through. Imagine, economic conditions worsen again. Maybe oil prices crash, or Chinese loans dry up. Elite unity fractures. A faction within the military decides the current path is unsustainable. The system breaks, not slowly, but suddenly. And when states fracture suddenly, the chaos spreads fast. Governance collapses in regions. Armed groups fill the vacuum. Migration doesn't increase gradually, it surges, overwhelming neighboring countries in weeks. For Colombia and Brazil, this becomes an immediate security crisis. For the United States, it's a strategic nightmare with no good intervention options. This future reminds us that the most dangerous outcomes often aren't planned by anyone. They just happen when systems under stress finally give way. The central irony of 2026 is that the United States has more power in Venezuela than ever before, and yet it has never been more vulnerable to the consequences of failure. The era when the United States could reliably dictate outcomes in its hemisphere is ending. Not gone, but fading. Influence still exists, but now it competes with Chinese investment, Russian support, and cryptocurrencies that bypass traditional banking. Power no longer guarantees compliance. Pressure no longer ensures results. This is the new reality. American policy increasingly means choosing which imperfect future is least damaging, not engineering the outcome you want. The future of Venezuela is not fixed. Small decisions on sanctions, oil, elections, and diplomacy can redirect the path, but no single actor controls the outcome. Not Washington, not Caracas, not Beijing. This isn't just a story about Venezuela. It's a story about how global power now works, fragmented, conditional, and constantly in motion. And in that world, the most important question is no longer who wins, but who adapts. To explore more AI narratives on the future of geopolitics, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and contribute to the discussion below.